Most people know the Gestapo as Hitler's secret police, the force that hunted enemies of the Third Reich in the shadows. But what happened behind the walls of their interrogation centers, specifically to the women brought through those doors, has never been fully reckoned with. The cases are documented, the survivors' accounts exist, the perpetrators in many cases were identified. What they describe is something that history has largely buried, until now. To understand what happened to the women brought before the Gestapo, you first have to understand what the Gestapo actually was, and what it was designed to do. The Geheime Staatspolizei, abbreviated to Gestapo, was established in April 1933, just months after Adolf Hitler became Chancellor of Germany. It was founded by Hermann Göring in Prussia as a political police force operating entirely outside the boundaries of normal law. Within a year, Heinrich Himmler and his deputy Reinhard Heydrich had absorbed it into the SS apparatus, transforming it from a regional instrument of repression into a national and eventually continent-wide machine of control. What made the Gestapo uniquely terrifying was not its size. At its height in wartime Germany, the Gestapo had approximately 32,000 officers for a population of over 80 million people. By any standard, that was a remarkably small organization for the level of terror it maintained. The reason it worked was not the number of agents, but the system built around them. A system that depended heavily on civilian informants, fear, and the complete absence of legal protection for anyone brought into custody. There were no lawyers, no formal charges required, no trial before detention. A person could be arrested on the word of a neighbor, a colleague, even a disgruntled acquaintance. Once inside a Gestapo facility, there was no mechanism to appeal, no oversight body with any real authority to intervene. The organization answered to Himmler, who answered to Hitler, and no one else. The Gestapo's primary interrogation headquarters in Germany was the building at 8 Prince Albrechtstrasse in Berlin, a place that became one of the most feared addresses in Europe. In occupied territories, regional Gestapo offices operated in cities across France, Poland, the Netherlands, Belgium, Norway, and beyond, each running their own detention and interrogation operations. The methods used in these facilities were formally authorized by a 1937 internal directive known as the Verschärfte Vernehmung, which translates as enhanced interrogation. The directive permitted, under certain conditions, physical coercion during questioning. In practice, these conditions were interpreted so broadly by local commanders that the directive became a blanket authorization for systematic abuse. Women were not a category the Gestapo considered separately from men in terms of their willingness to apply these methods. Resistance fighters, Jews in hiding, political opponents, people accused of helping enemies of the state, all were processed through the same system. The fact that someone was a woman changed neither the charge nor the procedure. What it sometimes changed was the specific nature of the treatment, and in ways that made the experiences of women in Gestapo custody distinct from those of male prisoners, and in many documented cases, more prolonged. What that distinction looked like in practice, and who the women were who faced it, is where this history becomes impossible to look away from. The women brought before the Gestapo came from nearly every background imaginable. They were Jewish women caught hiding or attempting to flee. They were members of resistance networks across occupied Europe. They were ordinary civilians accused of listening to foreign radio broadcasts, of sheltering fugitives, of saying the wrong thing to the wrong person. They were nurses who had smuggled medicine to people on prohibited lists. They were couriers carrying documents through checkpoints. They were mothers accused of failing to report a son or husband who had deserted. No single profile captures them all, but certain categories recur consistently in the surviving records. The Gestapo's reach was not limited to obvious enemies of the state. It received and acted on denunciations from ordinary citizens at a rate that has surprised historians. Some estimates, based on surviving case files from specific regions, suggest that the majority of Gestapo investigations were initiated not by their own surveillance, but by information passed by private individuals, neighbors, co-workers, people settling personal disputes. A woman who made a careless remark about the war could find herself summoned. One who had been seen speaking with someone later arrested could be called to account for associations she never considered significant. The threshold for detention was, in practice, extremely low. The female agents of the British Special Operations Executive, the SOE, represent one of the most thoroughly documented groups. The SOE was established in 1940 by Winston Churchill with the purpose of conducting sabotage and supporting resistance networks in occupied Europe. Among the agents it trained and deployed were women, chosen specifically because a woman traveling alone aroused less immediate suspicion than a man of military age moving through occupied territory. 39 women were sent into occupied France alone. Of those, 15 were captured by the Gestapo. The way those captures happened varied. Some were betrayed by informants embedded in the resistance networks they were working with. Some were identified through patterns in their behavior: a slight hesitation at a checkpoint, a document with an inconsistency the inspecting officer happened to notice. Some were simply in the wrong place at a moment when a German sweep operation was underway. What happened after capture followed a pattern that was both systematic and, in its details, deeply individual to each case. The first phase was always interrogation. The Gestapo wanted names, the names of other network members, of contacts, of safe houses, of British handlers. Every woman who passed through their custody was subjected to questioning designed to extract this information. The duration, the methods, and the outcome differed from case to case, but the intent was the same in everyone. Noor Inayat Khan was one of the SOE women sent into France. Born in Moscow to an Indian father and an American mother, raised in England and France, she was a radio operator who was deployed to Paris in June 1943 to support a network called Prosper. The network was already compromised before she arrived, though she did not know this. One by one, its members were being arrested. Khan managed to evade capture for months, operating alone in Paris after most of her network had fallen. She changed safe houses constantly, continued transmitting radio messages to London, and refused repeated advice to return to Britain. She was finally arrested in October 1943, reportedly after being betrayed by a French woman who had a personal grievance against someone in her circle. She was brought to Gestapo headquarters in Paris at 84 Avenue Foch, the facility that served as the primary interrogation center for the SD, the Sicherheitsdienst, the SS intelligence branch, in France. The building had been requisitioned from its French owners and converted into a detention and interrogation center. The upper floors held cells. The lower floors held interrogation rooms. Khan refused to provide any information. She attempted to escape twice, once nearly reaching the roof before being stopped. She was classified by her captors as hochgefährlich, extremely dangerous, and placed in chains. Even in that condition, she continued to refuse. After months of fruitless interrogation, she was transferred to Germany to the prison at Pforzheim, where she was held in isolation under conditions of particular severity. In September 1944, she was transported to Dachau concentration camp. She was executed there on September 13, 1944. She was 30 years old. She was awarded the George Cross posthumously by Britain and the Croix de Guerre by France. Her file at the Gestapo noted that she had provided nothing, but Khan's case, as extraordinary as it was one among many, and some of what the other women endured went further still. The physical conditions in Gestapo detention facilities were designed with deliberate intent. Isolation, disorientation, and physical suffering were not byproducts of poor management. They were tools. Cells in most Gestapo facilities were kept dark or at minimal light. Prisoners were often deprived of sleep through scheduled disturbances throughout the night. Food was withheld or provided in quantities insufficient to maintain basic physical strength. In winter, cells were kept cold. In summer, they were not ventilated. Medical care for injuries sustained during interrogation was either refused or deliberately delayed. Women who had been arrested with other members of their networks were typically separated from them immediately and kept in complete isolation, so that they could not coordinate their accounts or provide each other with any form of support. The isolation was maintained sometimes for weeks before formal interrogation even began, a technique designed to erode psychological resistance before questioning started. The interrogation sessions themselves were conducted in rooms separate from the cells. The format was standard. A prisoner was brought before one or more interrogating officers, seated, sometimes restrained, and questioned. The initial sessions were often relatively controlled, designed to establish what the Gestapo already knew and to gauge how much more the prisoner might yield. When the prisoner refused to cooperate, or when interrogators judged they were receiving incomplete information, the approach escalated. Formally authorized physical coercion under the Vernehmung included beating, specifically with a cane or stick applied to the back and legs, being forced to stand in stress positions for extended periods, submersion of the head in cold water, and deprivation of sleep by continuous forced standing. In practice, what occurred in interrogation rooms frequently exceeded even these permitted methods. Survivor testimony collected after the war by Allied investigators and by organizations, including the French Resistance Documentation Project, documented specific methods used on women prisoners. These included extended periods of beating, including to the face, burning with cigarettes, kneeling on sharp objects for hours, and cold water being applied in ways that produced both physical pain and prolonged disorientation. Violette Szabó was another SOE agent sent into France, a French-born British woman whose husband had been killed fighting with the French Foreign Legion at El Alamein. She was deployed first in April 1944 and completed a mission successfully before returning to Britain. She was sent back in June 1944, days after the D-Day landings in Normandy, to support the Salesman Resistance Circuit in the Limoges area. She was captured on June 10, 1944, near the village of Salon-la-Tour, after a running encounter with SS troops, during which she covered the escape of her companion by holding off the Germans until her ammunition was exhausted. She was wounded in the process. She was taken first to the SS barracks in Limoges, then transferred to the prison at Frasnes, outside Paris, and then to the SD headquarters at 84 Avenue Foch. She was interrogated repeatedly over a period of weeks. What occurred during those sessions was described later by a French prisoner who shared her cell at Frasnes and by German guards who testified after the war. The interrogations were prolonged and physically severe. She revealed nothing. She was transferred to Ravensbrück concentration camp in Germany in August 1944, where she continued to refuse cooperation. In early February 1945, she was executed at Ravensbrück. She was 23 years old. She was awarded the George Cross posthumously, one of only 3 women ever to receive it, and the Croix de Guerre. These were women trained for exactly these circumstances. What happened to those who were not? The civilians, the ordinary people who found themselves in Gestapo custody without any preparation at all, was, in many ways, a harder story. The SOE women are documented because governments and military organizations kept records, because their cases were investigated after the war, because their names were attached to medals and memorials. But they were a small fraction of the women who passed through Gestapo custody during the 12 years of the Third Reich. The larger group, far harder to track individually, were the civilians. Jewish women across occupied Europe who were caught hiding, caught using false papers, caught attempting to cross borders, were processed through Gestapo facilities before being transported to camps. Polish women accused of aiding partisans. Dutch women who had sheltered Allied airmen shot down over the Netherlands. French women who had fed a fugitive or passed a message they may not even have fully understood the significance of. The records of what happened to these women in Gestapo custody are fragmentary. Many of the facilities kept deliberate gaps in their documentation. Senior Gestapo officers ordered the destruction of records as Allied forces approached in 1944 and 1945. What survives is often testimony, collected by Allied war crimes investigators after liberation, by Jewish documentation projects in the years following the war, and by journalists and historians who tracked down survivors over subsequent decades. One case that is documented with unusual completeness is that of Hélène Boulot, a French woman from the Dordogne region who was arrested in 1943 on suspicion of involvement with the local Maquis resistance. She was 34 years old, a school teacher, and the mother of 2 children. She was taken to the Gestapo offices in Périgueux. Boulot had indeed been providing food and shelter to resistance members, a fact the Gestapo suspected but could not initially confirm. Her interrogation lasted over 3 weeks. During that time, she was subjected to methods consistent with the Vernehmung and, according to her own testimony given after liberation, considerably beyond them. She described sessions lasting through the night, physical treatment that left her unable to walk for several days, and being confronted with threats against her children as a means of pressuring her to identify her contacts. She provided no names. She was eventually transferred to the transit camp at Drancy outside Paris, and from there deported to Ravensbrück. She survived the war and returned to France in 1945. Her account was given in testimony to a French war crimes investigation in 1946. Ravensbrück itself deserves particular attention in this history. Ravensbrück was the largest concentration camp in the Nazi system, built primarily to hold women. Located about 90 kilometers north of Berlin in the state of Mecklenburg, it was opened in May 1939 and received its first prisoners, German women classified as political prisoners, criminals, or asocials, almost immediately. By 1944, it held tens of thousands of women from across occupied Europe. The camp operated in direct connection with the Gestapo system, women who had passed through Gestapo interrogation and had not been released, either because they had been convicted of something specific or simply because the authorities chose to continue their detention, were frequently transferred to Ravensbrück. For many, the transfer came after months of Gestapo custody had already taken a severe physical toll. Conditions at Ravensbrück included forced labor under brutal conditions, systematic underfeeding, exposure to extreme weather without adequate clothing or shelter, and, most notoriously, a program of medical experimentation. Between 1942 and 1944, SS doctors performed a series of surgical experiments on female prisoners, primarily Polish women, who became known after the war as the Ravensbrück Rabbits. These procedures, conducted without consent and without proper medical conditions, were designed to test treatments for battlefield wound infections. Many of the women subjected to them were permanently disabled. Some did not survive. The experiments were authorized at a senior level within the SS medical hierarchy, and the women chosen for them were specifically selected from the camp population without any process of consent or explanation. What the post-war investigations eventually uncovered about the specific officers behind these actions, and how few of them faced meaningful consequences, is where the history becomes almost as disturbing as the events themselves. The Gestapo officers who conducted interrogations of women were not, by and large, unusual men by the social standards of their time and place. They were former civil servants, lawyers, policemen, teachers. They had careers, families, houses. They went to work in the morning and came home in the evening. The distance between what they did during their working hours and how they conducted the rest of their lives was a feature of the system, not an anomaly. Klaus Barbie is perhaps the most thoroughly documented example. Born in 1913, Barbie joined the SS in 1935 and the Gestapo in 1937. By 1942, he was chief of the Gestapo in Lyon, France, the second largest city in France and a center of resistance activity. In Lyon, Barbie oversaw interrogations that became notorious even by the standards of the Gestapo itself. He was personally present during many of them, and was reported by survivors to have participated directly rather than simply supervising. Among those interrogated under his authority were women, resistance members, suspected accomplices, people brought in on the basis of informant reports. The most famous of his victims was Jean Moulin, the principal coordinator of the French resistance, who was captured in June 1943 and died as a result of the treatment he received during Gestapo questioning. But the documentation of Barbie's operations in Lyon makes clear that the systematic brutality was applied broadly, and that women brought to his facilities received no different treatment on account of their gender. After the war, Barbie evaded capture through a combination of factors, including, for a period, assistance from American intelligence, which believed his knowledge of communist networks in post-war Germany made him useful. He eventually fled to South America, living in Bolivia under a false identity for decades. He was not identified, extradited, and brought to trial until 1983. He was convicted in France in 1987 of crimes against humanity and sentenced to life imprisonment. He died in prison in 1991. His case was unusual not because of what he had done. The record of Gestapo officers who operated at his level contained men responsible for equivalent or greater numbers of victims, but because he was eventually brought to account. Most were not. Of the approximately 32,000 Gestapo personnel who served during the Third Reich, the proportion who faced any form of formal legal consequence in post-war courts was small. The Nuremberg trials addressed senior leadership. Subsequent Allied trials dealt with specific categories of documented crimes. But the mid-level officers, the men who ran regional interrogation centers, who conducted individual sessions, who signed the transfer orders, mostly returned to civilian life in West Germany. The government of West Germany established a central office for the investigation of National Socialist crimes in Ludwigsburg in 1958, specifically because the pace of prosecutions had been so inadequate. The office worked for decades to compile documentation and support prosecutions. The results were limited. Many suspects had died. Many others could not be tied to specific individual acts in ways that German courts of the post-war era required for conviction. The standard of proof demanded was higher than what most surviving documentation could meet. A 2014 study by German historians commissioned by the Central Office estimated that approximately 6,500 Germans had been involved in the Holocaust in ways that met the legal threshold for accessory to murder. Of these, only 1,000 had ever been convicted. The Gestapo's role in that broader operation, and specifically what its personnel did in the interrogation rooms of its detention facilities, fed directly into that accounting and into that gap. But the full story of what the post-war period failed to address takes on a different character when you look at the survivors, the women who came back and what they found when they did. The women who survived Gestapo custody and the camps that followed came back to a Europe that was struggling to process what had happened and largely unprepared to listen to the details. The period immediately after liberation in 1945 was one of institutional chaos. Displaced persons camps held millions of people across Germany and the formerly occupied countries. Returning survivors, from concentration camps, from forced labor sites, from prisons, were often processed quickly by officials whose primary concern was repatriation, not documentation. Women who had been through extended periods of Gestapo detention and wished to give formal accounts of what they had experienced often found no mechanism to do so. In France, the official narrative of the liberation emphasized collective resistance and national dignity. The details of what had occurred inside Gestapo facilities, particularly to women, sat awkwardly against that narrative. French women who had been subjected to treatment during interrogation that they found difficult to describe in acceptable public language faced a cultural environment that had little space for what they were trying to say. In Britain, the SOE's operations remained classified for years after the war. Families of women agents who had not returned were given minimal information and often had to wait years for official confirmation of deaths. The circumstances of those deaths were, in many cases, not disclosed to families at all during this period. The German women who had been imprisoned for political opposition, communists, social democrats, Jehovah's Witnesses, women who had married Jewish men and refused to divorce them under state pressure, returned to a country where the rubble was visible on every street and where the appetite for examining the recent past was, to say the least, complicated. Many of these women recorded accounts eventually, some through personal memoirs, some through the documentation projects run by survivor organizations, some through testimony given in connection with post-war trials. But the process was uneven, often painful, and filtered through institutions that were themselves selective about which parts of the record they wished to preserve. The French researcher and historian Germaine Tillion was herself a survivor of Ravensbrück. She had been arrested by the Gestapo in 1942 for resistance activity and spent nearly 3 years in the camp. After the war, she spent decades documenting the camp's operations and the experiences of the women who had passed through it. Her work, conducted alongside other survivor researchers, produced some of the most detailed historical records available of that system's inner workings. She died in 2008 at the age of 100, having given the better part of her post-war life to ensuring the record was not lost. One of the consistent findings across the testimony she and others collected was the degree to which women who had been through Gestapo interrogation experienced lasting physical and psychological effects that post-war society had no framework to address. The concept of what we now call post-traumatic stress disorder did not exist as a clinical category in 1945. The symptoms survivors described, difficulty sleeping, inability to tolerate confined spaces, prolonged states of fear that did not diminish after liberation, were noted by doctors without any consistent diagnostic framework or treatment approach. Women subjected to physical harm during interrogation often carried injuries never formally treated. Some had bone fractures that healed improperly during detention. Some had internal injuries sustained during extended questioning sessions. The documentation of these physical consequences was collected in fragmentary form by medical researchers after the war, primarily in connection with West German compensation claims. The compensation system established in West Germany required claimants to prove, to the satisfaction of German administrative courts, that their specific injuries resulted from their specific detention. The burden of proof was considerable, and the process required women to describe in formal legal settings things they had never found language for, even in private. Some did not pursue claims at all. Those who did and succeeded received amounts limited by a framework designed primarily around financial, rather than moral considerations. What the record ultimately shows, in the distance between what was done and what was acknowledged, between what the survivors carried and what the institutions offered in return, is a gap that no compensation system and no post-war trial fully closed. The history of what the Gestapo did to women in its custody is not a single story. It is a collection of individual cases, documented and undocumented, named and unnamed, spread across 12 years of a system that operated at continental scale. Some of those women, like Noor Inayat Khan and Violette Sabo, are remembered with medals and memorials and streets named after them in the countries they served. Others, like Helen Bolo, exist in the historical record only in the testimony they gave to investigators who came looking after the fact. And a great many more left no record at all. Their names, their cases, their specific experiences absorbed into the aggregate horror of a system that destroyed its own files as it retreated. What connects all of them is what the Gestapo represented, a system in which the full authority of a modern state was turned toward the systematic destruction of legal protections, of human dignity, and of the specific individuals who fell within its reach. There is a particular cruelty in the Gestapo's treatment of women that goes beyond the physical. Many held in its facilities were mothers who knew their children were somewhere outside, being cared for by whoever was available, or not at all. The Gestapo understood this and used it. Implied or explicit threats against children appear in survivor testimony from France, Poland, the Netherlands, and Germany. It was a specific form of pressure applied because it worked in ways that physical pain sometimes did not. The women who withstood it, and many did, were not extraordinary in any way that distinguishes them from the women who did not. The difference, where it existed, was often circumstantial: how long the interrogation lasted, what specific tactics were applied, what information the prisoner actually had that could have been extracted, and what the prisoner understood would happen to the people they named if they did name them. These were not simple calculations, and judging the choices made under those conditions is not something this record supports. The women who passed through Gestapo custody were not abstractions. They were people with specific lives, specific reasons for doing what they did, specific things they refused to say, and specific prices they paid for that refusal. The record of what was done to them, incomplete as it is part of what must be held against any account that treats the Third Reich as a chapter closed by the events of May 1945. It did not end cleanly. It ended with survivors carrying what had been done to them, in countries that were not always ready to receive it, into decades of ordinary life that were shaped in ways those countries were slow to recognize. The record exists. It deserves to be read clearly. If you enjoyed this video, please like and subscribe to our channel so you never miss out on more history documentaries.